Welcome to the UPF's Peace Talks webinar series, sponsored on this occasion by UPF, Europe, and the Middle East. I want to express appreciation to the team led by Dr. Otska and Jacques Marion, Mark Brannon, and many others for putting together this very significant and important program. Today we address extremely important and relevant topic for our time. Is there a future for the European Union and the rules-based global order? Question mark. The year 2020 has been a year of significant disruption, particularly due to the COVID-19 crisis. And yet the crisis has either spawned or brought to light a wide range of other concerns, such as governance or the world economy and even world order. For example, some question the future of liberal democracy itself in a highly polarized world. In addition, in the USA, where political, social, and cultural polarization is already at a peak, there are levels of social unrest not seen perhaps since the 1960s, owing to the recent killing of George Floyd, an African American, by a white police officer. Globalism and nationalism are at odds, rather than being seen as two necessary sides of the same coin. The UN turned 75 this year, and there are a number of conferences in various venues discussing the history, the present, and the future of that premier institution. Is multilateralism facing a crisis? All times in history are perhaps turning points, but it does seem that we are at a critical juncture at this particular time, and this forms the backdrop for today's conversation. The founding ideals and principles of UPF promote interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values, seeking to establish a world of international, interreligious, intercultural cooperation and harmony, a vision our founders describe as one family under God. In February of this year, convened a major world summit focusing precisely on this theme. Today's program, which has an all-star cast of panelists, will continue that conversation with focus on the future of the European Union. I look forward to today's program, and I trust you will find it stimulating and enlightening. Let me then introduce our moderator for today's program, Ms. Rita Payne. She is the former Asia editor for the BBC's World TV News and former president of the Commonwealth Journalists Association worldwide. Currently, she serves as its president emeritus and president of the association in the UK. Ms. Rita Payne.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Greetings to all from London, to our distinguished speakers and our panel, and those who are linking up to this webinar from across the world. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Universal Peace Federation for putting together this event with such eminent speakers on a topic which is of vital concern to us all, especially at a time of deep uncertainty with the world in the grip of the corona crisis. Both the rules-based world order established after the Second World War and the European Union system of close intergovernmental cooperation and integration are under such severe strain as to cast doubt on their very future viability. In both cases, increasing preoccupation with national self-interest as against the willingness to cooperate for the common good would appear to be the key destabilizing factor. Is this an opportunity for the European Union to reassert its position as a unifying force to counter the dominance of the big powers like the US, China, and Russia? I will now invite His Excellency Romano Prodi to open the discussion. Honorable Prodi is an Italian politician who served as the 10th president of the European Commission from 1999 to 2005, as well as a two-time Prime Minister of Italy. During his presidency of the EU, the euro was successfully introduced, the UN was enlarged to 10 new countries from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, and the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe was signed. So welcome, Honourable Prodi.
Thank you so much for the honor you've offered me to speak about this so important problem. There is a future for Europe, and can this future used in order to increase the possibility of peace in the world? This is broad. First, the picture is not a good one, the picture of the world. We have a desire of authority everywhere, from Philippines, China, Russia, Central Asia, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, United States, Brazil, everywhere in the world. In the last years, we had this incredible desire of authority. And so, the first question is, the old rules of so-called liberal democracy, in which we were just linked since we were born, are really in difficulty now. We have to say that people tries to have security, to find a future through a delegation of authority. The place in which this old, let us call old, but these liberal rules of liberal democracy are still prevailing is Europe, in spite of the tension of countries I mentioned before, Hungary, Poland. But basically, we are still the example in the world of the doctrine that was dominating till a few years ago, that was expanding, every year. The UN statistics were telling the list of the countries in which there were free elections and the role of the parliament, so on, so on, so on. And this is not anymore the case. First. Second, going into Europe, Europe was under deep crisis, started with a veto to the constitution by France and Holland. Since that moment, clearly the problem of the strength of Europe was in danger, and step by step has been rebuilt. I do remember when in 2005, in the end of my commission, many were thinking, look, this is the end of Europe. But step by step, Europe has been, in my opinion, rebuilt, with a difficult moment during the financial crisis, started in 2008. But now, with step by step, as I told before, we arrived to a new aspect of cooperation. But cooperation that is mainly the consequence of this coronavirus crisis, and that is not yet, let's say, working in many fields. Let's say defense, foreign policy, and other fields. So we are in this delicate moment of our union. So, first question, do we have the strength to support the rules that are the foundation of our democracy? Difficult to answer, I think that in this moment we are spectators, even of the events that are very, very close to our home. If you think to the Mediterranean, well, maybe because I'm Mediterranean, but I have a particular attention to the lake in which that is around Italy and around many of our nations, we lost. We lost not only the economic leadership or the military leadership, but really we are now spectators of a game that is done by old powers and new powers. And so my answer to has Europe the political and military strength to support our rules? I say, not yet. We are probably making a great jump in our economic and social cooperation, but in our, let's say, purely foreign policy field and military field, we have not yet organized Europe. Inside Europe, we are defending principle, and our European Parliament is still a cradle of democracy. But I am really worried because we have to talk about the future of the new events of the pandemic. Let's say, if you analyze the last figures, the new companies, the so-called internet-based companies that are commonly called GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, we have to add to this the Chinese list. They are gaining in power in an enormous scale and speed. And clearly, they are now the owners of the, not the owners, but a great instrument to impose or not impose the so-called rules in which we are based. Let's say freedom, freedom of information, balance of power in which we base our, and in this group we have no European company, no European company. Of course, I am an economist and probably I'm a little biased giving importance to that. I give an enormous importance to these new events. Enormous importance because they are really changing our life and the life of our countries. And so we are changing the concept of globalization that is in crisis, especially because of the tension between China and the United States. But we are also transforming the instrument of power that are influencing our rules and our democracy. And so we need, please, we need common rules vis-a-vis a common, let's say, defense and foreign policy that is difficult. Common rules vis-a-vis this new dominating power in the world, possibly joint effort to have a voice, even in this field that is totally changing our future. So clearly, Europe is still, at the end of the story, with all the limits, I stress it, but we are still the only, I don't say alternative, but the only possibility of, let's say, putting down the tensions that are mounting between the United States and China. But we are not conscious that we have to build new instruments to do that, you know. And now this European role to avoid the war, to avoid the clash, to improve peace is under threat because we are lacking the new instruments that are now dominating the world perspective. This is the initial picture I am doing. I can come back to discuss after the intervention of my colleagues, my former colleagues. But this is my starting point, you know. So we need a common effort to fill the gap that we have to defend the basic principle in which we have lived.
Thank you, Professor Prodi. That was, you raised a lot of points that we hope will be taken up in the course of the discussion. I think what is clear from what you've said is the old liberal values are under threat. They're being challenged. But as you presented, this could be an opportunity for the euro to hold together to counter the dominance of other powers such as the US, Russia, and China. So if I could ask you just one question before we move on to the next speaker. If you were to start with a blank page today to plan the European Union, how different would it be? What changes would you introduce? Just very briefly, please.
Look, the change.
Sorry, it's a big question.
No, but the change is, to be clear, let's say, we are still a great economic power. Great, number one in the world, you know. Well, I am doing my note thinking that UK is still part of it, but by far, you know, we are the biggest export in the world, and our lack of political union makes me absolutely spectators in the world. Look, can you believe that we didn't say one word in the new clash between Israel and Palestinians? It is unthinkable to that. Can you think that in Libya, we have now a clash between Turkey and Russia? Libya, that is 200 kilometers from Italy and close to Spain. This is something that if we don't fill this gap, we are not credible. We are not credible. You know, so it's this is so. The first step is to work for a common foreign policy.
Thank you very much. Well, I will now turn to our next speaker, His Excellency José Manuel Barroso, a Portuguese politician and university professor. Professor Barroso previously served as the 11th President of the European Commission from 2004 to 2014, and the 115th Prime Minister of Portugal from 2002 and 2004. There is, of course, much, much more we can say because you have such a long list of titles and achievements, but I thought I'd keep it brief to give more time to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita, for your introduction. And let me say it's indeed a great pleasure for me to be here with you in the company of my good colleagues and friends, Romano Prodi and Herman Van Rompuy, and to have the possibility to address such a distinguished audience. So there are basically two issues as topics for our discussion: the European Union, its future, and the multilateral rules-based order. On the other hand, starting with the European Union, let me tell you a story. June 2012, I was then president of the European Commission. We were still feeling a very difficult moment, the so-called euro crisis, the sovereign debt crisis. I invited for a brainstorm in the headquarters of the European Commission in Brussels, the chief economists of the most important banks operating in Europe. And I've asked them two questions. First, how many of you believe that Greece will be able to remain in the euro? Was the first question. Do you believe Greece will remain in the euro? And almost all except one, said, Mr. President, it's impossible, Greece will have to leave the euro. Debt sustainability analysis and so on, that was the sentiment of the markets then. Greece will have to leave the euro. But Greece is still with us in the euro. Second question, about the future of the euro. Will the euro survive? And then it was 50-50. Half of those very qualified economists, they said, most likely the euro is going to crumble, disappear. Others said, no, it's going to be difficult, but it will survive. The reality is that the euro today is the second global currency in the world. So I'm telling you this story why? To make a point. I really believe, and I'm no longer in any political capacity, so I'm speaking with all my freedom, but I think with intellectual honesty, I really believe that the resilience of the European Union and of the euro is higher than most people think, and at least most commentators acknowledge. I remember the story of Mark Twain, when they said during the war that he was killed, and he was not, and he wrote a letter to this newspaper saying, the news of my death are slightly exaggerated. The same applies to the European Union. We always listen to the idea that Europe is going to crumble, the European Union is going to disappear. I think the forces of integration are stronger than the forces of disintegration. There are problems, and serious problems. I have lived those problems during the 10 years leading the European Commission and also in other capacities, in the European Council as Prime Minister and also before as Foreign Minister of my country. But as Romano Prodi said, step by step, typically the European Union finds a solution. He mentioned rightly the constitutional treaty could not be approved because there were 2 countries that voted against in referenda. But then we could find a solution with the Lisbon Treaty. 10 years later, the Lisbon Treaty is not so ambitious as the constitutional treaty, but the basic points are there. So this is the point I want to convey, namely to those of you that are less familiar with the European Union, those who live outside of Europe. The European Union, by definition, is incremental. Its progress is fragmented, sometimes extremely frustrating, time-consuming, suboptimal solutions, as the economists like to say, but they are suboptimal because they are the result of a compromise. And when you have a compromise, by definition, the decision is not your first best, it's probably your second or third best, but is the decision can have people together. So I think the European Union has problems, but it's indeed a great construction. In terms of regional integration, it's by far the most advanced process ever in terms of sharing sovereignty. And by the way, it has been a force for the good. I will never forget the moment that I shared with my good friend Herman Van Rompuy, when on behalf of the European Union, we received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 in Oslo. And the Nobel Peace Prize was given to the European Union because the European Union, its values, stands basically for peace and for, I believe, the common good of mankind. Now, about the rules-based order, multilateral, I think there is a real crisis. I mean, it's obvious. Look at the WTO, the crisis there, and the global trade going down. Look at the World Health Organization. So there is a real crisis today in multilateral order, partly because the United States, the current administration, that was in fact the country who shaped globalization after the Second World War, it was basically the West. Now it's not so committed that it was before. For some reason, the United Nations headquarters are in New York. The IMF or the World Bank headquarters are in Washington. They are not in Beijing, Moscow, or Paris, or in Latin America, or in Africa. So basically, that great construction of multilateral order after the Second World War has not received the same support of the biggest shareholder, because the United States, from my point of view, remain the most influential country in the world. And in fact, there are also global tensions going on between the United States and China, not only those, other very important problems of conflict, namely in Asia, where we see this coming up. And so the multilateral order is in crisis. I think the European Union is in a good position to give a positive contribution. Why? Because by definition, genetically, the European Union is a multilateral order. We are now 27 countries after the United Kingdom decided democratically to leave. We share sovereignty, and we are doing negotiations every day. The European Union is a permanent negotiation. So I think the European Union, by the way, in its treaties, it's committed to multilateralism. It's one of the points in Article 3 of the Lisbon Treaty. In Article 2, we state our values, from human rights to rule of law, to respect for minorities, to equality of rights between men and women, and democracy, and so on. But then we say also what are our goals for the global community, and it is a commitment to multilateralism. So I think the European Union could and should do more to sustain the multilateral order, because in a way, we are at the regional level in Europe, a laboratory for globalization. We are used to a culture of compromise, of permanent negotiation. Now, is it going to happen? Your question is, what is the future of the European Union and the future of the multilateral order? My answer is, it depends. The future depends on decisions that have not yet been taken. The future depends on decisions. It's not yet done. It depends on the quality of leadership. And there I have some concerns about the quality of leadership in some countries around the world, and the commitment to this global order and global governance. Now, I am not naive. After so many years in politics, you can no longer be naive. I have no illusions. There are, of course, different systems, and there will be confrontation. There is competition, at least there is competition. But the question is, can we have cooperation and competition? I believe we should have cooperation and competition. Let's give an example. United States and China, and by the way, Europe and China, we don't have the same political regime. There are different regimes and very important differences. But that should not be a reason not to cooperate when it comes to address some global public goods, like peace, fight against climate change, fight against international terrorism, cooperate, for instance, fighting the pandemics. And we have seen now, unfortunately, that there has not been sufficient international cooperation fighting the pandemic. It's a failure of the international system. By the way, during the financial crisis, we started the G20 at heads of state and government level. At that time, it was the European Union. It was, in fact, the president in office of the Council, President of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, and myself. We went to speak with George Bush at Camp David, telling him, look, the G8 is not sufficient. We need more. We need to have a coordinated response. And then the idea came of organizing the first G20 at heads of state and heads of government level, where I had the honor also of being representing the European Union. It was China, India, Korea, Brazil, besides, of course, the G8 members. It was, I think, it was not a complete success, but it gave a contribution, at least to avoid full-scale protectionism, and there were some measures taken together. Now, during this crisis, we have not seen the G20 cooperating. So there is a real crisis in the global order, and I think wise leaders all over the world even with different political regimes, different political ideologies, I think they should cooperate for a minimum of cooperation in terms of global order for those common public goods. I think it makes sense because the level of interdependence is so high that we can no longer say your side of the boat is sinking. We may be sinking altogether. And that, I believe, could be a message that the European Union, if it works more coherently, also in the fields of foreign policy, external relations, and also in defense matters, could have a greater political influence that could be more proportional to its real economic and trade influence. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Honorable Barroso. I mean, your experience shines through, and I think you also give one hope that there's still, despite all the challenges, there is a future in cooperating. But you also did mention your concerns about the quality of leadership. And that, of course, leads inevitably to mentioning someone at the White House who has been a bit dismissive of the European Union. How much of an impediment do you see this in asserting the European Union as a force that is going to make a difference to the world?
Look, I have the highest respect for the office of President of the United States of America, for the office. So I will not engage in any kind of criticism. But I have to say very honestly that in Europe, we are very disappointed with the current state of relations with the United States of America. Most of us are Atlanticists. We were speaking before the founding fathers of the European community, from Konrad Adenauer to Robert Schuman to Alcide Gasperi to Jean Monnet. They were really Atlanticists, and the United States were supporting the creation of the European community. And today, we don't see that commitment to transatlantic cooperation, which is really strange. Because, of course, there are differences between the United States and Europe, but basically we share the same values of freedom, of democracy, of open societies, of open economies. So this is a problem. I'm not going to say that the responsibility is only on the shoulders of the current American president. In fact, this trend was already existing for some time, but I think it's a problem. And I think we should work together more. I continue to believe that the United States and Europe and others around the world, but there are many links economically, trade, investment, and also in political and defense matters between Europe and the United States. By the way, most European countries are members of NATO, and the majority of the NATO members are members of the European Union. So I think it makes sense to work together if we want to give a positive contribution to a more humane globalization.
Well, thank you. I think it's upbeat. I think you have conveyed hope because there are many reasons to feel a bit grim about prospects. Now I would like to invite our third speaker to take the floor, as it were. This is His Excellency Herman Van Rompuy, a Belgian politician who served as Prime Minister of Belgium from 2008 to 2009, and then as the first permanent president of the European Council from 2009 to 2014. He currently serves as chairman of the Administrative Council of the College of Europe in Brussels. So, Honorable Van Rompuy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor, and I will speak about globalization and Europe, the two topics you mentioned from the start of. The pen of pandemic refers to the global nature of this. An instance, one place is enough to create 450,000 victims all over the globe, and the epidemic is not over yet. It could have happened anywhere in the world, of course, but it shows the high level of interdependence, and it is really
a sign, this pandemic, of great fragility. And this interdependency does not, however, mean strong connectedness or the awareness of a shared destiny. It certainly does not equate to world governance. On the contrary. In recent years, world trade has been growing at a slower rate than global GDP. Although we cannot speak, or not yet speak, about deglobalization. The rise of protectionism does not give the impression, or does give the impression, that the high level of globalization of trade and investment is over. And all this is before the corona crisis. This protectionism in the United States and elsewhere, this protectionism is the result in the age of internal dissatisfaction with the consequences of globalization, which translates partially into deindustrialization in the United States. We are also familiar with this in other Western countries, also in the UK. And moreover, both countries, the UK and the US, are governed by nationalist governments or that dislike supranational authority. The US turns against institutions and rules, WTO, World Health Organization, United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention, UNESCO, International Court of Justice, even there are doubts about NATO. And the UK leaves the EU and the single market. For the UK, the concept of global Britain comes at a time when its former main political partner, the US, is choosing the opposite course. However, there is also the question of what the concept of global Britain means when it will set trade tariffs against its main trading partner, the EU, to which almost half of its exports and goods and services go. In the EU, a process of greater concern began a few years ago about a range of phenomena, such as unfair competition from countries granting massive state aid to their exports and investments, and such as the almost monopolistic practices of digital giants. The idea of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty gradually gained ground. And the corona crisis has always also made it painfully clear that the EU is far too dependent for the health of its citizens on medical supplies and medicines from the rest of the world. But we are also too dependent in terms of artificial intelligence, energy, defense, and other areas. But the pandemic also gave examples of American companies wanting to buy up successful European companies, and fears arose that a depressive recession would also make some weakened European companies attractive to Chinese and other investors. And the EU has recently shown both parties that we cannot be blackmailed and that we are not for sale. The European response also goes beyond taxing or regulating digital companies towards European values. I'm referring to the GDPR, but also towards eliminating the EU's digital delay. And that's a key problem for the European economy. In general, one could ask how the EU can play a geopolitical role when it is so dependent in key economic and other domains. Dear friends, geopolitics starts at home. In the EU, this approach is not seen as protectionism, but as a better protection of its own interests. It's about much more than a game of words, protectionism and protecting. Autonomy does not mean autarky. The new attitude is part of a correction to blind globalization. After 1945, the social market economy came into being, which was a correction to the failing pre-war capitalism. And today's corrections have to come about on a supranational level, on the European level, or a global level. But in any case, supranational, to correct globalization. The EU continues to believe in rules-based trade, otherwise it would not have been concluded free trade agreements in recent years with Korea, Singapore, Canada, Japan, Mercosur, Vietnam, etc. The EU tried to establish a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. President Barroso and myself were heavily involved in this. We were trying to establish this with the United States. And we tried to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership with Japan, the US, Canada, Australia, Mexico, Vietnam, and others. So both initiatives were brought down by the current American president. So the EU is also trying to conclude a trade agreement with the UK on the basis of zero tariffs, zero quotas. We are deeply engaged in rules-based free trade. In vain, apparently, these negotiations, I hope not, but apparently until now, the prospects are not well. Unfortunately, negotiations on an investment treaty with China have been dragging on for too long. The 2020 target will not be met. As I said, there will be no deglobalization, but companies now, after the corona crisis, will rethink their supply chains in order to avoid the risk of unilateral dependence on a single supplier. A different, more decentralized, organic pattern of multi-localization of production systems will emerge. We have also this new phenomenon of reshoring. It's the opposite of offshoring. And reshoring has become a topical theme at the level of nations, also in order to counter excessive dependence in strategic sectors. Among the major economic players, China, the US, and the EU in particular, there is distrust. This is also the case in relations of Western countries with Russia, and this lack of trust also exists within the Western camp and also within Asia. We must not forget that the period prior to the corona crisis was already an ordeal for the world economy. The trade war between China and the US is a pointless war, all the more so because it also damages the American economy. China needs to review a number of trade and investment practices, but a tariff war will not bring a solution any closer. I repeat, the current corona crisis occurred at a time when the rules-based multilateral order was already under very strong pressure, mainly due to the rise of protectionism. The World Trade Organization cannot even function properly anymore. The G20, President Barroso was referring to it, has become a mere discussion forum without decision-making capacity. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the only international body that succeeded in finding a global consensus in Paris 5 years ago. So we must now work with the coalition of the willing to restore the functioning of the WTO and modernize its rules. And the same coalition of the willing must deliver on climate change. The corona crisis has increased the distrust I mentioned, the global distancing between these global actors. So we are speaking about social distancing. There is now a global distance. This didn't give rise to new potential military conflicts, but it is an obstacle to jointly tackle the major problems of our time, such as climate change and economic prosperity for all. All this at a time when, rationally speaking, and I'm apologizing, I still believe in irrationality. All this at a time when, rationally speaking, international cooperation is more necessary than ever. Think again at the biggest threat to mankind, climate change. And don't forget, extreme poverty is on the rise, again, after decades of decline. And confidence I spoke about distrust among global actors. Confidence will only be restored if everyone abides by internationally agreed rules, especially those on trade and climate. The crisis should strengthen the need for global institutions and expertise, and should recognize the importance of international cooperation. It may also remind people around the world of the shared destiny of all mankind. It is often said that globalization has increased inequalities. Theoretically, an unaccompanied opening of the market forces would cause cumulative impoverishment and cumulative enrichment. On the contrary, the globalization we have experienced has drastically reduced extreme poverty. But the corona crisis has exacerbated inequalities internally in each of our countries. Some people were better protected against the virus than others. Austerity went too far and was socially blind. Dramatically increased unemployment also plays a major role. If these inequalities come on top of other discrimination and injustices, this has already led to socially explosive developments in some countries. You know what I'm referring to. The focus of almost all politicians in all countries is on domestic politics, not on geopolitics. The pandemic hits some countries harder than others, especially those with few reserves. Rising debt in emerging markets poses a risk to the global economy. Happily, in May, the G20 suspended sovereign debt payments for 76 poorest countries in the world, which will free up about 11 billion euros. That's a happy thing. The EU, and it is said already by Romano and others, the EU is a global actor, not a world power. For that, it lacks a military arm. But in today's relevant areas, such as trade and climate, the EU plays a major role because it can speak there with one voice or deliver the same message. By the way, on a global scale, there are no more all-powerful nations. They don't even want to be anymore. But the first condition for the EU playing a geopolitical role is unity and autonomy. In the last decade, during the multiple crises, we have had to focus, unfortunately, too much on our domestic problems. Banks, euro, terrorism, migration, now corona. But even these problems partly transcend the European Union. In today's confused world, the EU certainly has an important role to play. Sometimes I hear that we are no longer relevant. But if one is relevant because one is endangering the world order, then I choose to be a different kind of relevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. There's so much, again, that one would like to ask you more about, but of course time is limited. It's interesting that you've spelt out areas in which you think the EU has been relying too much on outside forces. Before you go, just one question I would have for you is to find maybe one area where the EU could be seen to be a force that makes a difference, and that could be climate change. So do you have any concrete suggestions of how the EU can be more assertive on this front?
On climate change, effectively, we can play a major role. And we spoke with one voice in the Paris conference, the historic Paris conference of December 2015. But again here, we have to lead by example. And that's why the famous Green Deal of the European Union, and we agreed already on the objectives, the Green Deal is so important. If we implement what was promised, then we will be the first carbon neutral continent in the world by 2050. So if we want to bring the world closer to the status of a climate-friendly planet, we have to show that we are capable of implementing the objectives of the Green Deal. And that's from utmost importance. The Green Deal, you know, is as important as the single market of Jacques Delors. We are always in the European Union, we are speaking about a big project. This is effectively a very big project. It is a profound transformation of our economy. It's not about a soft sector anymore. The Green Deal is a combination of soft values and hard power, hard economics. And I think this is the biggest project. After that, we have overcome, of course, the economic consequences and the health consequences of the corona crisis.
Well, thank you. So we'll be, I think, wanting to know more about the Green Deal and some of the ideas you put forward. So thank you very much to you, and also to all our other distinguished speakers for sharing their valuable insights. It is now time to hear from two young people who have questions for the speakers. First, a question from Maniola Vašmatic in Albania.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. So my name is Maniola Vašmatic. I come from Albania, a nation which still needs to meet 15 criteria toward Albanian's full membership in the EU. I'd like to address my question to any of the panelists. So my question is, please could you say what you see as being the prospects for the EU agreeing to start accession talks with Albania and other Southeast European nations that aspire to EU membership? And why you think that EU has not been keener than it has been to embrace new members from this region? Thank you.
Who would like to respond to that among our speakers?
I can do.
Lovely, thank you.
Look, probably I am not reliable because I do think that the inclusion of the former Yugoslavian country and Albania had to was a priority before, even before, you know. Clearly, we must insist on criteria. When we did the enlargement, we were very, very severe in helping the countries to let's say, to meet the requests. But now I do think that we are too close. We must understand that we must end the problem of the borders of Europe. And I do think that this area is part of Europe, and then stop, because I hope that Turkey could be another, but now is impossible. So my answer is, I don't understand why we don't speed up in ending this problem. Also because and then we shall have to change our rules of governance, every consequence. But we cannot be afraid of the inclusion of countries that together can be 100% of European GDP, and they are really making an enormous progress because they started from so far away. But I know that I am an extremist in favor of speeding up the process.
Thank you very much. Our second questioner is Matteo Bergamini, founder and CEO of Shout Out UK, a multi-award-winning education platform that provides world-class training and programs on media and political literacy. So Matteo, would you like to present your question, please?
Thank you very much, Rita. My question is, unsurprisingly, around media literacy and political literacy. Considering the current rise in misinformation and with the UN declaring recently a global infodemic, does the panel think there is any future for the EU and global governance as a whole without first tackling the deficits of media literacy and political literacy in society at the moment?
Since we don't have much time, which of our distinguished speakers would like to address this, please, briefly? What about...
I can say something.
Thank you. Okay.
I agree we should address this issue, but I think, by the way, the first issue about media is freedom of media. And generally speaking, I'm not saying the situation in Europe is perfect, but at least compared with other parts of the world, it's certainly better in terms of freedom of media. But I understand your point is more than that, it's about literacy. I think that has to be done also at national level. We cannot expect the European Union from Brussels or from Strasbourg or Luxembourg to do everything. That is a responsibility also at national level, and not only for the governments, for organizations of the so-called civil society. Because today we have a real issue with literacy or lack of literacy, with let's say the abuse of social media, with the so-called fake news and manipulation. And that's a problem also for democracy. And once again, it comes to my earliest point on the quality of leadership. I think we need leaders that have the courage also to stand for openness, but at the same time to fight the current atmosphere in some of the media that in fact are not providing accurate, objective information. Besides that, European institutions have done something. For instance, the European External Action Service and also the High Representative, Vice President of the Commission have tried to identify when there are foreign sources to manipulate our media, because that is also, unfortunately, today a concern. We know that in the global public space, there are also attempts to, let's say, shape the reality in a way that is, let's say, in the interest of some countries against others. And so also on that field, I think the European Union should not be naive and should have the ways to protect itself.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Now we've got other questions, but I don't think we'll get through all of them, but I'll try my best to see how we get on. There is a question submitted by Mr. Hannu Hassinen from Helsinki, Finland. And the question is, in your view, has the subsidiarity principle been properly implemented in the EU? And if you think it has not been, is it likely to be in the future? And it's quite a long question, this. And in what circumstances? And is there an insurmountable tension between the centralizing tendency in the EU and the desire of nation states to keep a degree of control over their own affairs, even to the point of feeling driven to leave it? Could I address this question perhaps to Honorable Van Rompuy?
Yes, thank you. Subsidiarity means not only that you have to decentralize, that's a unilateral, one-sided interpretation of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity means that you have to exercise the power at the most appropriate level in the interests of the people. But most of the time it is interpreted as decentralization. Europe is not a superstate. And we discovered this in the Corona crisis. In the beginning, the EU was absent because health was not a competence and is still not a competence of the European Union. So that's the best example that Europe is not a superstate at all. We are discussing now the European budget. That is 1% European budget of European GDP. You know, public expenditures in general in each of our countries represent almost 50%, 50, of the GDP of each of the countries. So I would say the European budget is 1/50 of national budgets and national public expenditure. So it is a misunderstanding also that the European Union, that in the European Union is some kind of concentration of power taking place. Not at all, not at all. And even if you ask people, and then the recent polls show it, if they want more powers to the European Union, they are asking those three questions not in general, but related to climate change, related to our, let's say, to our position to face the new competition of America and China, or in other areas, and I mentioned already health, then most people say, yes, we need more Europe. If you ask people in abstracto, they will mostly, in a lot of countries, answer negatively. No, the European Union does not need more powers. But to confront it with the challenges, they give a different answer. So it's not an ideology. It's just, if we want to survive, if we want to solve the problems, we need a European dimension of the problem. It's not only I'm saying this because I'm a pro-European. I think it is shown also by many polls in many countries, and especially in the crisis. And for me, the Corona crisis was very revealing. People asked me in the street, where is Europe? And I said, you're often complaining that we have too much Europe, and now you are complaining that we have not Europe enough. And subsidiarity is just going in both directions. But the most important thing is we have to solve the problem. If more Europe is needed, then let's do it.
Thank you very much. So now we have another question submitted by Dr. Nodirbek Salayev, Deputy Rector of Tashkent State University of Law, Uzbekistan, on behalf of its law professors. Since 2013, China has been pursuing its controversial Belt and Road Initiative, so far involving the funding of infrastructure projects in about 70 countries worldwide. Why does the EU not set up similar aid projects of its own to provide an alternative to China's project and to expand its own sphere of influence? And what possible downsides do you see in the EU taking such a course of action? Shall I address this perhaps to Honourable Mr. Prodi?
Yes. The problem of the Silk Road is a great problem, you know. I do think that this is a very interesting proposal, clearly targeted to China, well decided to China. But in the first part, Europe accepted it with enthusiasm. We have to think that the European countries, the most important European countries, agreed to take part of the investment bank correlated to Silk Road. But this type of cooperation did not make progress, honestly. And now we are in a very peculiar situation in which the idea is still, I think, a great idea, but the execution is not how it was proposed in the beginning, you know. And so I do think that we must rediscuss it and take some common initiatives between Europe and China. Maybe I say, look, not in Europe, not in Asia, maybe why not to build 20 hospitals together in Ethiopia or something similar, you know. But let's say to have, because now it is only a Chinese proposal, and with also rising some problem because, you know, on a European side, it was not so well received, the institution of the 17+1, that say countries that institutionally have special agreement with China. And so there is now a rising sentiment in Europe that China is trying to divide Europe, and I don't think so. But anyway, the message is like that, and so I do think that we have to go back to the basic idea, to implement it in a more, let's say, cooperative way, because now trade and interest between Europe and China are really great, and we must rewrite also the rules that we apply in our relation, but we cannot start a fighting or a breakup of our relation, because they are vital for China and vital for Europe.
Thank you. Time is tight. This is the next question we're squeezing in. It's a very large question, but maybe President Barroso might be able to give us a brief answer to this. The question is submitted by Mr. James Brodie from London, and he says, leaving aside the question of how the EU needs reforming, what would be the key elements of the rest of the international rules-based order that, in the panel's view, would need renewing in order to make it viable? And can you please outline a realistic scenario by which such renewal could come about? Thank you.
First of all, I agree that the European Union needs reform. When I made here, of course, a strong defense of the European Union for the reasons that were clear, but I'm not saying that the European Union is perfect. There are issues that need reform, and by the way, they are going to be the subject of this now conference on the future of Europe that has been being prepared, namely engaging with the citizens, hopefully, so to receive that input. Now, in terms of the global order, the most important point is the commitment of the main stakeholders. By the way, this, I believe, it's also the issue with the European Union. We need the ownership of the project, and that I can give you my personal testimony. It's very often comfortable to criticize the institutions, but let me tell you that the European Union can also, of course, the European Commission, the Council, the Parliament can, of course, work better in many areas. But at the end, the European Union depends on the ownership of what our countries do for it. And if they continue to use the European Union as the scapegoat of their own problems, as I say, Europeanizing failure and nationalizing success, the European Union will not be able to deliver. The same applies to the global institutions. Look at the United Nations. United Nations goes as far as the members of the United Nations let the United Nations go, namely the Security Council, and in the Security Council, the P5. So if the members of the Security Council do not commit themselves to the United Nations, and if they don't fund it, and if they don't agree on decisions, and they systematically veto important decisions, of course, the United Nations will be paralyzed. And then it's easy to criticize the United Nations and not to see what are or not doing the stakeholders. So for me, the real question is a political one. That does not mean that the organizations cannot review their way of working, more effective, sometimes less bureaucratic, etc. But the key is the commitment, the ownership of these international institutions by their shareholders, namely those who have more power and can commit more resources, not only financial, but also political, intellectual, and attention resources.
Thank you. We've got a minute left. This is a challenge for the speakers. Could you briefly, in maybe 2 sentences each, just sum up some things that we can take away from this discussion? So very quickly, shall we go back again to start with Mr. Van Rompuy?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons we can draw from this crisis is that we have to remain believers in the multilateral order. And we have also to remain believers in the European project. And at the end, the best defender of the multilateral order is the European Union. But the European Union has to become much more autonomous, much more sovereign, less dependent in many areas from the rest of the world. And then we can play again a geopolitical role. We have to take our fate in our own hands in terms of the economy, the digital, defense, energy, and in other areas. And then we will have more weight on the global level, and we can push the world more to multilateralism and away from protectionism, rising authoritarianism, and rising nostalgic nationalism. So we have a big role to play. We are at this stage in some areas a global actor, but we have to become a global actor in many other areas so that we can become a world power. We are not there yet. We are not there yet. But as President Barroso said, we are much more resilient than most people think. And gradualism is a method that we are using, but this time we have to make major steps, bigger steps than we did in the past. But for me, the EU is the best guarantee for a multilateral order, and multilateral order is a guarantee for peace.
Thank you. I'm afraid now we've run out of time, but I think the word that sticks out now is resilience. And that gives hope for the EU in future. So again, once again, I'd like to thank all the speakers and the audience. And now I will hand you over to Dr. Walsh for his final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you indeed very much, Ms. Rita Payne, and to our speakers, Excellency Romano Prodi, Excellency Jose Manuel Barroso, and Excellency Herman Rompuy. Truly stimulating and enlightening discussion. Very, very successful webinar. We hope to continue this series of webinars. We have the association within UPF called the International Summit Council for Peace, which has precisely this vision to draw upon the experience and expertise of precisely the kinds of leaders that have gathered here. Very, very encouraging. We will continue these conversations, and we will explore further the issues of multilateralism, the future of democracy, the future of European Union. And I just thank all the panelists once again. I thank you also, Rita Payne, for so ably moderating this session, to the audience who asked very good questions from Tashkent to Albania to the UK to Finland and other places, well over 400 participants internationally. So my great appreciation again to UPF in Europe and the Middle East region, to these great speakers. With that, I close this webinar with great appreciation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.